Hi, and welcome to our webinar on web design for accessibility. Hi, I'm Mindy League. I'm the Vice President of Digital Experience here at ProMet Source, and I'm joined by Armstrong, who is a Drupal developer and an accessibility expert.
Hello.
And we decided to put on this webinar for you today so we can have a discussion about what it means to create ADA compliant, accessible web designs. And I'm a designer and he's a developer, so we thought we could have two different perspectives to bring to this discussion and this topic. And so we're going to have some conversations about what it means to be accessible and how to get there as a web designer. We will be recording the webinar, and after the webinar today, we'll send you an email with the link to both the recording and also this presentation deck. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with us, but you'll be receiving that after the webinar. And we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end today, so feel free to use the Q&A part within your Zoom meeting if you need to pop a question in there. We'll be happy to help answer any questions, and we also have a chat if you want to ask questions during it. If it's relevant, feel free to do so. So we're glad you're here. We're glad you're here today to talk with us. And we are ProMet Source. So we develop dynamic web solutions, web development to help create complex web designs to support mobile applications, strategic marketing. And we help our clients with accessibility. So we have specialists here at ProMet that are certified in ADA Section 508 and the WCAG or WCAG.
WCAG, yeah.
Yeah, WCAG requirements. I say WCAG and he says WCAG, but we mean the same thing. What we're going to cover today, we're discussing why accessibility is important. There's a lot of reasons we practice that. We want to emphasize it. And we're going to talk about the basics of web accessibility, so what it means for your designs as a web designer, and usability and accessibility. And then we're going to recap and have the Q&A session. So accessibility is often abbreviated as a numeronym ALI. So you might hear us refer to it as ALI, which is actually A and the number 11 with a Y, because there's 11 characters omitted between the A and the Y. So this is why this is kind of relevant, and you might hear us say ALI. And this is good because the misconception that a website design that's accessible, in the past has been the site has to be black and white with large lettering and really not a lot of flexibility in the designs, but we want to help kind of debunk that myth and help expand your ALI toolbox so you can see what needs to happen to make your designs accessible, so you can increase the flexibility of those accessible designs. We have an example of a site that we had created here at ProMet that is accessible and it's also award-winning. So we thought this was an important example to share with you. It's engaging, it's colorful, it kind of debunks the myth, as I mentioned earlier, of websites have to be, large scale, black and white, not engaging. There's a lot of interactivity on the site, a lot of images, and it's also accessible. We'll start off with some reasons we practice accessibility. We want to give access to the web for all users, regardless of their ability. It costs less to begin with accessibility in the design process and lowers the chance of lawsuits for having accessibility issues. And then also as a byproduct, SEO is improved when a site has good accessibility. Here at ProMet and within our personal design philosophy, we practice human-centered design, which is a methodology that hosts lots of practices from user research to UI design. But the foundation of this philosophy is that we're building something new. In this case, it's a website, and it's for someone other than ourselves. So we need to build empathy for those people. And in this case, we're building a website or the solution for people with disabilities. So this practice of universal design says if you build something for an edge case, like a person with a disability, you can make something that everyone can use better. So it's this based on the census statistics in 2012, almost 19% of our population has some sort of disability. 8% have difficulty lifting or using their mouse. 6.3% have a cognitive or emotional impairment. 3.3% have vision impairment, or they rely on screen readers, magnifiers, or are colorblind. And then 3% have hearing impairments. And there's also things, temporary disability. So if you're out in the sunshine using your device or your mobile phone, you might have a temporary disability of not being able to see your screen very well.
Yeah, and I really like the point of those percentages there, because I've definitely had many meetings in the past where clients have said, like, why are we doing this? There's only going to be one user touching the site, and realistically, it's not. There's a lot.
Yeah, it's nearly 20% of users have some sort of disability that would require them to have different access to the site. And so the way they access the site is very different than the way we would, right? We're used to using our mouse and our keyboard, and here they're using screen readers, voice controls. So these are the assistive technologies that they're using. And when we create a site that is accessible, it provides the information to these devices that can then transmit it better to the person with disabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
So a person that might have a disability would be experiencing the internet very different than we do. So we don't want them to miss out on important information. So in this example, if you've ever seen this color blindness test, I don't know, Aaron, if you've taken that before.
Absolutely.
So this is a simulation. So if you fail, don't worry, too much. We have the dots on the right with numbers, and there should be a number in each dot, right? So a person with a disability might not see that, whereas now you can reveal that there are numbers in each dot. So it's a very subtle change, but it's enough that you're missing out on crucial information. So if you see a difference before and after, it might be how a person with color blindness could, for example, would experience the web. If you don't see a difference in those two dots, you might have some color blindness, or you need to adjust your screen monitor.
And actually, within our Q&A, there was a question asking about, is there any particular accessibility, like non-compliant issues that would likely spark lawsuits? And this would definitely be one of them, where color compliance is a huge thing when it comes to accessibility. And if you guys don't know, Domino's Pizza is currently going through a lawsuit right now, which is absolutely massive for having a non-compliant site. So
yeah, we'll talk about that here in just a second. So the web designers have a very important role in this process, right? To help set that color, like that example for color contrast is set by the designers who help concept. And so my role in the project is normally within this design and concept phase, whereas Aaron is in the develop phase. So we're handing him a lot of documentation and designs. So the workflow and the planning and the things we give that help demonstrate the concepts need to incorporate that accessibility.
Yeah, it definitely goes a lot. It goes a long way when the concept and the designers already have accessibility thought out beforehand before passing to developers. It just helps tenfold.
Yeah, so actually, we have this diagram showing
that's
that
right.
the cost of change, you said it helps tenfold. Well, literally, we have demonstrated here that if you're building something and within the concept, you don't account for accessibility, then you have to go back and revise it. It costs, more.
Exactly. And I've seen this firsthand on a lot of the projects that we've taken as like just remediation projects for accessibility. And, when it's not, accessibility is not thought about in the design phase, and it's, passed down to development, and maybe even it's been pushed live and now we've figured out there's accessibility issues. The cost that it takes to repair that is so much more, because it's not just a simple change. You're going through the command of talking to the project managers, figuring out what needs to happen, talking to the client, getting that color change, developing it, pushing it. There's this huge workflow that has to happen. And so if you can catch those accessibility issues up front, you'll be in a much better position.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to show here is that, in the concept time, if we're building accessibility in during the design phase, it's a low cost to fix, right? And you just talked about if you wait till we're already developing and then we go back and make it accessible, it's 10 times that cost. But if you wait till after launch and then you realize your site needs to be made accessible, it can be 100 times the cost, in general terms, to fix that accessibility issue.
Absolutely.
And then we had a question earlier about, web accessibility lawsuits. Yeah, we are seeing an increase year over year in how many cases are brought to the courts regarding a web accessibility issue or lack of accessibility, right, for different users. So we saw 181% in 2018 over 2017. and expect that those numbers to rise as awareness becomes, hey, we expect a website that's accessible to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. We've definitely seen an increase in audits and remediations on our end, so it definitely matches that.
And we have the byproduct we talked earlier. This is a benefit of having an accessible site, is that it actually does improve your SEO. So your search engine optimization can improve because you are making your site accessible. Screen readers and search engines both rely on title tags, which is part of an accessibility compliance. Search engines also use alt text. Logical header hierarchies are important. We'll get into what these mean. And screen readers function most effectively when the page navigation and the layouts and the designs are straightforward. So
yeah, exactly.
This is just sort of a byproduct, why a good practice for accessibility. So now we'll go into the basics of web accessibility. So as a designer, what do you need to know as you talk about web accessibility? So we have the guidelines here, which are really intense. I took this screenshot of the WCAG guidelines, and it kind of runs off the page. It was one long page, and you have to dig through. As a designer, it was hard for me to pull out, what we needed to know.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of rules when it comes to being WCAG compliant, and so we've kind of pinpointed a couple of those within this webinar to try and show you some of the key points as designers that you should be looking for. But accessibility is huge. It's not just cut and dry. You have to really dig into the meat and potatoes to understand what makes an accessible site.
And to that point, we have a sort of the tip of the iceberg today, if you will, of what you can do as a designer to help make the site accessible. There's a lot of other things to cover, but we're really going over some basics with you now, so you get a good idea of where to begin. The few things we're going to go over today are choosing accessible colors, fonts, sizing your text, headings, how to use images and brand, element labels, and then visual interface indicators, hover, focus state, interactivity, and content. So we're going to run through these topics real quick with you, just to go over what the rules are around each one. So choosing accessible colors. So I'm going to ask Erin this, right? Is there sufficient color contrast being used? Text should have sufficient text to background contrast ratio to help users with partial vision loss and those with color blindness. So these are the rules.
Yeah, so these are some of the things that we see most often when we're say auditing a site and remediating the issues that make the site non-compliant. In particular, just kind of the color ratios in order to make these colors compliant. And so when text is under 18 points or 24 pixels, it needs to match this 4.5 to 1 ratio. And we'll go in it in a second, but there are tools to help you to check those. And basically what it's doing is it's checking the luminance of your colors and making sure that someone with color sighted issues would be able to understand it. And then as we get further into it, it's not just one font ratio. There's different, or color ratio, sorry, there's different ratios based on the font sizes. So if your text is larger than 24 pixels or 18 point, then the ratio needs to go to 3 to 1. And even further in, when you have links within your body text of a page, there needs to be a proper contrast ratio between that link and then the surrounding body text.
Yeah, so basically the bigger the text is, the lower contrast you need to have, right?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And the tools, my mechanical designer, I was like, how would I check the contrast? And as you mentioned, we have these tools that I use religiously for checking contrast, right? So we have the contrast checker. WCAG, someone asked a question, what does WCAG stand for?
I think it's web compliance.
Web compliance accessibility guidelines, right? Yeah. Together we'll get there. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And web aim link contrast checker. So this one checks I have some examples here, so we'll talk about that. Here's the color contrast example. So the reason we want to make sure we have that high ratio of contrast, if you were color blind and you had vision impairment, you might not see these colors. So this orange to yellow background might be lost on you, and you're really seeing grayscale. So this is a mock-up of what you might see if you had some color blindness. You can see the gray is hard to differentiate on the background. So that's why that contrast is important. So we're going to run this contrast through this contrast checker. You're basically feeding the contrast checker the hex codes. So your foreground is going to be your text, and your background is going to be your the background color. So these hex codes are equivalent. So I have the orange from this example of the heading and the background. And you can see here in this contrast checker, you have a failure on AA and AAA.
Yeah, it actually might be worth noting that, there are different levels of compliance. There's A, AA, and AAA. Now, what we strive for is not what we strive for, what we do is AA. AAA is a lot harder to meet and is really restricting, and is much more used in like really strict government guidelines. But the AA 2.1 WCAG is what we strive for compliance.
So yeah, it's much more stringent up here when you get to the AAA. So we have the ratio here, and then we also see the bigger text, 18 point, it still is failing here, right? So we know that this contrast ratio is not high enough, and we need to change something about it. Now we check the second one, which is a different tool. You have to look at the link text to the body paragraph text. So here we ran the link color, which is the bright blue, against the body text, which is the darker blue, against the background color, and you can see the link to body text doesn't have a high enough distinction or contrast, but the link to the background text passes, and the body to the body text to the background. So with these two tools, we're able to check this whole entire section. So the results are, in summary, we failed the heading text to background, the body text to link text failed, but we passed on the body text to background and the link text to background. So this, as a design, you have to think about, now what do I need to do to make this compliant? So it takes a little bit of fiddling. You go into the tool, find the right color combination.
You've got some choices to make in order to, it's going to follow along for the rest of the site. So you have to, make sure you're making, proper decisions.
Right. So here's an example of what we chose to make this more compliant, and hopefully you'll see you have greater contrast. So if you're having color blindness or visual impairment, you'll see greater contrast. As we darkened the header against the background, we chose a different color. And then we also modified, instead of changing the link text, even though it passed, we changed the body text. So it wasn't exactly one-to-one what the tool recommended, but we're still able to get a compliant pass on all of these changes. So this is just an example of how that might work. So next we'll talk about choosing accessible fonts. There's been some debate on what fonts are the most accessible in web. And ironically, there's some difference and distinctions in how print and web are read. And so there's been debate. Historically, print uses a serif font. So a serif font has those little feet on the letters, and the sans serif doesn't. So historically, we use serif on print, but web is actually moving to a sans font. So not to say you can only use sans serif fonts, but we have these guidelines and recommendations that are provided by research. AA gives some, WCAG gives some recommendations, but primarily this is through best practice.
Yeah, exactly. And so when it comes to the body text, it's best practice to keep to a sans serif font. And when it comes to the heading text or larger text, then it is okay to use some of those serif fonts as needed. So you don't have to limit yourself to only sans serif for your entire design. You just have to be smart about where you're putting.
Yeah. So in this example, we have serif fonts as the heading because it's bigger. So best practice says if you have a bigger heading text that's well spaced, it's okay to use serif. So we tend to use those in the headings. Sans serif fonts are more recommended for the body and paragraph text. I mean, you can use either you know, this is just the best practice. It's not going to be a rule violator. You won't not pass if you're using sans serif fonts, right? But this is just make sure there's spacing that you need between the lines and lots of spacing within the area of text, which we actually have an example for you here of how to do the spacing and font sizes, regardless if you're using a serif or a sans serif font.
Yeah, so I really like this slide because I don't think this is something that's really well known. And so that not only are there minimum font sizes that should be kept throughout your site, which is about 16 to 18 pixels, but there's also some default spacing in between, like your line spacing in between your body text, and that typically should be 1.5 times the height of your font. So if you have a font that's 16 pixels, the line height should be 24 pixels, and I don't think that's something that's really well known. So it's definitely something worth pointing out. And then when it comes to your heading text, it should be at least 20% times the size of the body text. Now, when we get into, you know, our larger headings, it ends up being much higher than that. You know, your H1s and your H2s are likely, you know, 2 to 3 times the size of your body text. But that 20% should be your minimum.
And there's some good points brought up here too. I do like this slide also because we have two values here. We have 12 to 14 points, which are in the WCAG guidelines. It calls out points, but we're using pixels because I think most designers have pixels set up in their tools. If not, you can adjust, you know, what displays in your tools like Sketch or Photoshop or whatever you're using to display points or pixels. So they're not exactly the same. Be aware if you're using web design software that if you're set on points, you have a different numeral value than pixels. Actually, pixels are a little bigger than a point. And so I always start with the body text, whatever size you have here, and then work out from there. So you have the body text, and then you have the heading text double, you know, 20%, and then your spacing. I like what you said about the heading text is minimum 20% the size of the paragraph text, right? So you can go up in values. You just so you have to keep that in mind as you're working because you have your headings need to have multiple of those because within HTML, I think there are 6 heading elements defined.
Yeah, 6.
As a designer, you're working from the you're designing all the different levels. So on the right is an example of a design that utilizes different heading styles. And so the designer, you're indicating what those heading styles are. So be sure you design up to 6. Mostly you need all 6. And then the headings are larger on the page, they're bolder. And it's beneficial for everyone, whether you have a disability or not, because you're scanning a page, right, before you read it.
Yeah.
And then screen users, actually, technically, they're using the headings to navigate the page.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that we test is making sure that works when we're testing a site for accessibility. And so when a user is using a screen reader in order to access the content on a site, they can't, you know, they don't see the text and they're just hearing it being read back to them. Well, they need the ability to be able to hop through to the main sections of the website, the different headings as well. And so making sure that these are set up properly goes a long way.
Right. Okay. So headings are important, and the designer gets to value them. So that 6th heading, the smallest one needs to be that minimum size, right?
Exactly.
And then ordering headings. So as a designer, if you're designing a page layout, you do need to order them in descending order, right? So 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. So they need to be in this proper nested order. And so, you know, your H1, your H2, H3. And so as you go down, you can't skip headings. So as our example here, we did H2, H3, H4. You can't go from an H2 to an H4. And so when you're designing your pages, you should keep that in mind so that a developer doesn't end up developing the wrong heading tags. Now, when we're talking about, you know, when it's okay to use, you know, jump from the H4 to an H2, that's okay going up. It's just not okay going down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you can jump going, it's like a table of contents, right? You can jump going up, but you can't go the reverse, you know, way.
Good
so
example.
You're nesting. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to talk about images and text on top of images. So as a designer, and this is one of our favorite things to do, is design a big hero image and make it very colorful, put large hero text on it. So this is like a banner that might be on the homepage of your website. So the text placed on top of those banners also needs to have the contrast ratio. It needs to pass that contrast ratio that we went over earlier. So we have to do a few things in this case to make that happen. This is white text on top of an image with a lot of different values, color values on it. So this case, we had to use drop shadows, outlines, other and layovers like background elements to provide that contrast. So in this one, we have this bright sun here. So you can imagine the white would fade into the sun if we didn't have these drop shadows. But it would pass over here easily on the text.
Yeah, and this is something that we see a lot on sites. Putting text on top of images is definitely a really nice treatment to do design wise, and we definitely see sites that aren't compliant in the way that they're introducing it. And so, as a quick example, if you didn't have that text shadow, the S on the slider might be compliant, that white compared to the blue. But if you look at the R in hero, if we didn't have that shadow, that white next to the sun wouldn't be compliant. Mm-hmm. And so that would cause that text not to be compliant. And this is something that, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and once this is a real website, you can change the picture in the background. So we don't know what's going to go back here. Once it becomes a live website, after weeks or months, someone might want to change the images out.
Yeah, exactly. So you're making it so that like the onus isn't on a content editor. Whatever image they put there is going to be compliant, and so it's really important to get this done up front.
Yes, great. And so we have, this is how I was able to test this one. If I just took the image out in my layers within the software I'm using, Sketch or Photoshop, whatever you're using, you can just remove the image layer and see how the text stands out against the background, and run this through the color contrast tool by kind of getting an eyedropper here and grabbing this outside color hex value along with the inside color hex value. So using the eyedropper, getting those hex colors. I had to put an opacity overlay over the image, a 25% opacity, 75% transparent, and then drop a shadow under the text. So if it passes without a picture, it's definitely going to pass no matter what picture is underneath it. So that's how we got around that and able to use white text on top of an image.
Yeah,
other image, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's actually a quick comment asking about icons and logos on top of banners. And so, logos don't need to have an exact color contrast between the background, but those icons, it depends. So the icon, if it is just an icon that's not has anything contextual to it, it doesn't need to be compliant. But if it has some sort of contextual meaning to it, that links to a button or is a link to a different spot on the page, then that would need to be compliant compared to the background image. So it's definitely important to make those distinctions.
Okay, super. So this image, we have text on top of graphics. So something designers can keep in mind that's important is you don't want to use an image by itself that's communicating something really important. So if you pop an image in that has a process like this water cycle, you would also want to add content to describe what's happening in the image for people who either are using screen readers alone or have different types of ability to kind of intake the information.
Yeah. So incorporating text on top of the image, you want to keep that to a minimum when possible. But if it has to be there, then you definitely need to have some context in text form so that the user can understand what the image actually means if they're using, say, a screen reader.
Yeah, in this case, this is where they kind of like bake the text into this image, right? So this isn't an HTML. Like this example I showed before is HTML on top of an image, where this is sort of baked in.
Yeah, exactly.
And you also want to use good alt text. If you're in the development side on an image like this, you would describe with your alt text what the image is trying to communicate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean that kind of goes into trying to keep those images not crazy complicated, because alt text can be difficult to convey, depending how complicated that image is.
Yeah, and speaking of images, we get a lot of client logos that are brand guidelines that are already existing, or you may have brand guidelines on a project that you're working on, and you're running those colors through the contrast tool and learning that they're not, the contrast ratio is not acceptable. So for example, this is a logo of a project we completed, and none of these colors are contrasting enough, the greens and the oranges, on the white background, and they're failing. So we had a question about this logo, and we learned that logos aren't required to be. Let's go back. I will answer that question.
Yeah.
We have but logos aren't required, right, to be accessible. So
yeah, exactly. I think the important distinction would be that, you know, the logo itself isn't required to meet any sort of color contrast ratios. But if you're taking the colors from the logo and trying to fit the site, then that's when you might run into issues, and you'll have to darken the colors or lighten the colors depending on your scenarios.
Yes. But we can see we weren't able to use those colors then in the website. So we have an example of the website. We had to increase the contrast. So we had to consult here in this case with our client that we needed to darken the blues, the greens, and the oranges so that we have the sufficient contrast when we are bringing things in. So they're still able to maintain their logo. We just had to add additional colors to their existing brand palette to meet the criteria for that, because they wanted these color fields to be in their color palette.
Yeah.
So we just increase those contrasts.
Exactly.
Another thing that designers create that developers require for accessibility are ordered lists and unordered lists. So as part of your design, if you haven't designed these, an ordered list is a bulleted list starting with numbers like 1, 2, 3, whereas an unordered list would just be, bullet points.
Yeah, so these are really important to be added into like your style guides as you're designing a page. And it looks really simple, but it actually goes a long way, where if it wasn't set up as, say, an ordered list and you couldn't tell that there was numbers beside it, then a developer might not set it up as an ordered list. And when a user uses a screen reader, it actually gets read out. It'll say ordered list number 1, and then read that text out. So it's really important to make sure that that distinction is there.
Yeah, so it creates way better user experience if you're using the screen reader, because you're going by just audio and it's announcing the list and reading them in order for you. Great on that. Element labels. So this is another item we wanted to talk about, where all form elements will have a visual label associated with them.
Mm. Yeah, so we see this all the time. And so ideally, you want to have a visual label, like a visible label that is connected to your input. So you can see it when you click on it, it focuses on that input. So in our top example here, I have a visible label, and then I have an input with a placeholder text. And so that's a perfect example of what you would typically do. Now, it's definitely possible to, in our example on the bottom, to have an input field that doesn't have a visible label. However, that does require now that there needs to be what's called an ARIA label, so that if user was using a screen reader and they focused on this input, it's going to read that ARIA label out. So it'll read, search this directory. And so it's really important to have those distinctions, and maybe even as you're doing a design to note that this field needs to have an ARIA label, and it would be easier to pass it to the developer.
Yeah, that's great. So you can design it to have the field label, or you just have to instruct your developer would know through your documentation or otherwise to be sure to put that ARIA label, which is really a audio label or a tag for the screen reader.
Yeah.
And then this is something I found interesting whenever I was starting to work with an accessibility. You have I knew through interactive design, you had a default and a hover state, but then there was something called a focus state, which I wasn't familiar with because I never had experienced it. Tabbing through a site, right, or using a screen reader would provide you with the focus state. So you have your buttons, links, form elements, or anything with functionality would have both a hover and focus state well as the default state. So the hover is when your mouse is over it, and the focus state is when your tab or your keyboard is set to that.
Yeah, and this is something that we see a lot. And like when you're tabbing through a site, by default, links and inputs and stuff like that, they are tabbable. You can get to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean the user knows where the input is focused on the page. And so when it comes to your hover and focus states, you still need to have at least two changes. And so, your hover state on this example here, we have a background change plus an underline. In the focus state, we have the background change, the underline, and then it has that focused outline. And so that's required when doing focus states so that the user can easily navigate the site with, say, just the keyboard, only using the tab key or on a screen reader using your screen reader keys, and being able to completely follow where you're navigating on the website.
Yeah, great. And this is something of a mantra while I'm designing, is every time I do a hover state or focus state, two state changes, right? So like that.
Exactly. Yep.
Like in this case, we're changing the color background and we're putting an underline. There's more state changes that aren't listed here. Like you could have grow could be a state change.
Yeah, exactly. You could make things bigger. We listed kind of the default ones that are kind of your go-tos. Your color change is used most often in almost all buttons. And then after that, then you have your underlines, your bolds, and
there's so many different things like grow. There used to be some like things that have faded away, like wiggle on hover, things.
Okay, yeah.
But there's other, so we can get creative as designers too to define what those hover and focus states are, the state changes are for those.
Exactly.
And interactivity and content, this is one we use a lot to create an engaging site. We want it to be interactive. We want something to happen when you're hovering over content. And there are some common best practices for that functionality that Aaron's going to share with us.
Yeah, so I quickly put this together, and I wanted to just note about, when you're creating some pieces of functionalities, in this example, it's a card style. And when possible, don't be hiding content that's only visible on a hover or focus state, because the user might not know that there is more content to be seen. And then on top of that, when it comes to mobile, oftentimes you see sections be completely dropped. They think it's not important when it comes to, say, mobile. But really what should happen is you should, collapse those sections or stack them differently. But that content does need to be there from an accessibility standpoint. You need to have that functionality and that content accessible on all different screen sizes and devices.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind, because from a UX perspective, we want to keep things simple where it's possible and consistent, right, between different experiences.
Consistent.
So as you mentioned, we can rearrange or collapse things where you maybe access the content differently, but it still needs to be available. And in this example of the interactive hover states, this is just a good best practice. As you're hovering over a card, it reveals something more on the other side. But you could do something else, like in the example we showed at the beginning. Maybe there's just a color change or an image change versus a content change. So it's still important and functional while providing some bit of engagement for your user.
Exactly.
And this is something important to keep in mind too as a designer, is you don't want to use color alone to convey meaning or content. So a lot of times you see like fill out all items in red, or something like kind of instructional text, which isn't. Oh, here, that's the example you have. Yeah, that's not good.
Exactly. So when let's say a person that has issues with color reads this, they don't know what's actually required. And so if we look at our correct example on the right hand side, it's the required fields are in red and they're also marked with an asterisk. And so if they have color issues, they'll be able to see the asterisks. And then, when it comes to even development, we even go a step further and make sure that it's got the required fields, so it gets read out on screen readers and such.
Yeah, that's a good example. So when we're designing, communication is key. So all these things we just discussed, you're capturing them in your designs, but you're not either documenting them or communicating them to your developer, you might lose out. So this is an asset that we create it's really valuable to not only the development team, but we also give it to our clients so they understand what we're following in terms of colors that are accessible and things on their site. So this is a style guide. So when you, obviously as a designer, you hand over a package or assets to your developers, you give them mock-ups for desktop, mobile, whatever, but we also add this additional element of a static style guide, and they go build the CSS or the cascading style guide from it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see this case, we added the colors that have already passed and how you're kind of document how you're using those colors. The heading classes we talked about are here, they're listed.
Yeah.
And then we have, the quote call outs, the ordered lists, the unordered lists, your tables, and then these buttons. We have all those button states: default, hover, active, and focus listed here. We have the 2 color state changes. We have bold and color state, or 2 button state changes, bold and color.
Yeah.
And we're showing those hover states here within the static style guide.
Yeah, and it's hugely important when being passed over a style guide. And how much value it brings for a developer, that you're not having to, guess some of these things. You've got that some of these descriptions written out. Like we even have our designers always do desktop and mobile, and so they even have, say, the pixel size for desktop versus mobile and stuff like that. So it goes a long ways.
Yeah. So there's less interpretation of the designs, less trying to figure out the logic behind them, and we're basically giving a map to how things function.
Yeah.
So that wraps up our design sort of tidbits. As we mentioned, it's the tip of the iceberg of what we can do with accessibility, but we're going to move into user experience. So one thing is a bit of caution is just because you're creating something that follows those guidelines for accessibility doesn't always mean you're making a good user experience or that it's usable. So the user experience, somewhere between accessibility and usability, we have to find where it's the best user experience for them.
Yeah.
And the fallacy is that the technical criteria supposedly make a site accessible, and it does help do that. But every time you just build in those checklists doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be usable for people with disabilities or even people that don't have disabilities, right? We've seen some instances where just because you have color contrast doesn't make it easy to use.
Yeah.
So the strict focus on that scorecard isn't going to ensure success, but what we recommend to adopt usability is to go back into your user experience best practices. And in this case, we have usability testing, right? So traditional usability testing, you'll see an example here of like a click map of a wireframe where we put a prototype out in front of an audience of users other than ourselves, to get their feedback on what's working. So in this example, they're clicking, they're providing comments to us through the interface of the usability test, and they're clicking, so we're getting quantitative and qualitative feedback. And it shows how the users really use the site. It gives us their behavior so we can determine usability, and we can hear their emotional response to that.
Yeah.
And then we make changes based on those results, and it eliminates that guesswork. But within there's a difference that we need to keep in mind, that our audience is going to have those disabilities. So based on a research group, we were able to extract these best practices from their own research on conducting usability studies for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And this is what they recommend, is conducting on-site usability studies with them. So if you're able to be on-site with them where they feel comfortable in a place like their home office or home desk, or go to them, let them use the assistive technologies they're comfortable with. So we showed all the array of assistive technologies they can use, and then let them know we're recording them, ask if they're comfortable, don't move anything in their environment, and then read the tasks aloud to them that you want them to complete, and encourage them to express their thinking verbally or in writing, and then be sure and capture that, right? So it's a little different than our online prototype, usability practice, or doing a Zoom video with someone, being able to be with them and let them be in their home environment is really what's recommended.
Yeah, and I think the results for doing it, some sort of usability testing, is huge, just because you can design a really nice looking site. You can design a site that's fully accessible, but you could go into these accessibility or not accessibility, these usability things, and realize that, you know, while it looks good, it's not usable. The user can't find what they're looking for.
Right, and it's important to test that with both people with disabilities and people without disabilities, just to get the full range of feedback. So we're learning, we can identify issues early, we can fix them in that design phase, you know, like we talked about at the beginning, that cost to change later on. So you can fix them early, or what they need. You get buy-in on stakeholders on why something is a certain way, because you have that research and data behind what you're creating. And then one of the tenets of universal design we talked about early on is solving issues for edge cases creates better usability for everyone. So we want to be able to identify that and call that out. So takeaways from today's session, you know, accessibility and great design are not at odds. We think they can coexist on the same site. A significant percentage of the population has some sort of disability to be accounted for, where this WCAG compliance is required to for them to effectively access all the information on the web. Web accessibility related lawsuits are on the rise. So from a business case and a business standpoint, it makes sense to practice this. And it's not complicated. We can arrive at an accessible design within a lean framework of the right tools and clear guidelines. And a focus on accessibility at the start of the design process, as opposed to during development or after it's complete, is beneficial. And accessibility does not equal usability. You still need to go through user experience practices and user studies to get that and confirm accessibility for your and usability for your site.
Exactly.
So Aaron put together this list of resources for us. We have some of the tools. We'll be sharing this deck with you, so you'll have these links. The tools we just walked through for contrast checkers are on here.
Yeah, and I added a bunch of others, you know, links just straight to the WCAG guidelines. There are examples of like color blindness issues, or even just articles on some of these examples that give really good advice when doing designs. There's accessible color palettes, which is a really cool one, colorsafe.co. So these are all really good examples that you'll be able to access.
Yeah, here's a link to the WCAG guidelines themselves. ProMet has a designer's checklist. If you want to download that, it's available as well. Some other learnings. And then we have a blog that has lots of accessibility content. We pulled one link to one article for you, but there's other content available on that blog. In ProMet, we do accessibility training. If there's more information you want to learn about design and development for accessibility, that is available. Also, accessibility audits and remediation. If you need us to take a look at your current site, we can do that for you. We can help conduct usability research, work with your UI design or UI design team to consult on how to make things accessible. So there's a lot of ways we can help if you need further help or consultation around accessibility and web design. We have these upcoming trainings. There's a 2-day course to fast track web accessibility for whether you're a designer or a content editor or a developer. So we have this quick course, as well as a 1-day for business perspective on policies and perspectives for web accessibility. And then we have a coupon for you guys. If you're interested in these training classes, we have a 10% coupon, Friends of ProMet 10. We'll be sending that out to you as well. And now we're going to get to the questions portion of our webinar.
There's only a couple of questions that are kind of left unanswered. There's one from Andrew Schmidt. Says, for the water, what is a good example that you would use for alt text for that image? So this was that water cycle. And so there's actually 2 things that I would do when it comes to, you know, this is kind of more on a development side, but on alt text, I would keep the description brief, and it would just talk out. It would say image of the water cycle graphic. But then, because a water cycle is not some super simple thing, and an alt text is meant to be small and simple, what you would do is you would add what's called an aria described by, and that is where you can point to, say, a hidden div that has a full paragraph or sentence that fully explains what the water cycle would be.
Yeah, that's a good answer, because we struggle with that short alt text as a content editor, but with the developer's help, you can add the aria, right, to tag to expand it.
Exactly.
Further.
Yeah.
Another question we have is the text description, is that applicable to embedded slides? So if you're embedding slides on your website, how would you describe that? Or would you do alt tag, or would you write about the slide deck, or how would you make that accessible?
Yeah, so for slideshows, it actually depends on kind of like with the icons. It depends if they're actually bringing any sort of context to it. If they're actually just straight, say, a background image slideshow, and there's not really any context, you are required to have an alt tag. And so you could add an alt tag that describes it, but because it's just decorative, you could actually just put alt equals and just leave that blank. So it really depends if there's context needed.
Okay. Thank you for that. And then another question, are there rules of thumb concerning color combinations to avoid, or colors that have greater tendency towards accessibility? So yes, we find that colors that have blues and blacks in them are more accessible, where anything like that's orange and yellow really, really are hard, and turquoise for some reason. That the band on the color wheel, orange to turquoise across, really has a hard time. So we're leaning towards blues and reds, and less towards yellows and oranges and turquoises, so we can trend in that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And has the pandemic impacted the need for digital accessibility? Yes, absolutely. We're on websites, we're online more, I think, than ever before, where you're shopping online, you're browsing online before you go out and shop in the world, or go out and go to the county courthouse. You're finding out what the rules are, and there's just so many different scenarios where people are online more as of late than maybe they would have been prior to the pandemic. So yeah, absolutely. Not only is the pandemic causing the shift, but you can see the trends as people become aware of accessibility standards, and that they should expect an accessible site, similar to when you go to a park or a public place. People now expect it to be accessible to them with handrails and the built-in features that they need to access that park or public place. They're expecting the same thing from their websites.
Yeah. And there's actually one more question. It was typed in the chat here, and it says, do you have any tips for how to discuss these design topics with colleagues who don't understand ADA compliance, but have lots of options or opinions about the web?
Yeah, absolutely. You could start with our slide deck here, showing them the lawsuits, the cases for building accessible design. I think it's really important. We hear you. You're back. You froze for a moment.
I'm back. Oh my goodness.
You're back.
Okay. Yeah.
We heard your question. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, it's definitely important, and I think you need to come with a bit of ammo. You need to show some inaccessible things, and also talk about the lawsuits that are currently happening. And so it's definitely a difficult topic to try and talk about for somebody that has lots of ideas for how they want a design to look. But if you come at that with a little bit of knowledge and some examples on how you would do something similar, keep it nice but still keep it accessible, then I think that that'll go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. In the practice of human-centered design, we're reminding your whether it's your colleagues, you're not building this for yourself, you're building this for someone else. Like the website isn't for you to access your own information, it's for other people, and reminding them that you are not your audience, right? It's for users X, Y, and Z. And within those users, 20% of them have some sort of disability that they need to have access to that site, almost 20%. So.
Yeah, exactly.
So any other questions? We're going to wrap up here right on time if there's no other questions. Thank you all very much for attending today's conversation on designing for web accessibility. We appreciate it, and your interactive questions. Those were very nice. We will be sending you a recording of today's session as well as the slides. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Yeah, thank you much for coming, everybody.